All right.
We say all praises be to the Creator, all power to His people. In the name of Yahshua, the Black Revolutionary Messiah, I greet you, my brothers and sisters, in the spirit of truth and the words of peace. Shalom Aleichem. Giving a special salute to the Black Messiahs. Our motto is stop waiting for a Savior and be one. Stop waiting for a Savior and be one. Today, family, what we are doing is we're going to have an exciting book review of a book called The Color of Law. The Color of Law. Our Minister of Information, Sista Spitfire, along with Sister Sharon, they've been studying this book that deals with why we got in the condition we're in. You know, it's easy to point out what's wrong in the city, what's wrong in Durham, this is wrong in Durham. But the question is, how did we get here? How did we get here? So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Sister Spitfire, and she can give you more information about the book, who wrote it, and we'll start from there.
All right. Greetings all. So as you know, today we're doing a book study or a book review of Color of Law, which during this point in time in 2022 couldn't have come at a more ironic time based on some of the past events that have unfolded over this past month and even in last year, just as local as incidents that have occurred in places like McDougal Terrace. So we ask ourselves a lot of times why we're in the predicament that we're in as far as having real estate and owning property, and as far as wealth and other issues that we have as Black people in this country. And many times, according to society, many may think that Black people are just simply not trying hard enough or simply not pulling themselves up by the bootstraps. But after studying this book, I've come to really realize that the facts that are stated in this, not just opinion, actual facts that are in this book, make it very clear that a lot of the conditions that Black people have today are systemic and are intentional. And some are systemic and without malice intention, but nonetheless, that has happened to Black people as a result of a lot of these policies. So this book, The Color of Law, written by Richard Rothstein in 2017. So this book was written 5 years ago, before the orange guy came into office. So just to kind of even let you know, really the time frame that this book is written in, but he's basing it on incidents that happened as early as World War II, 1920s, 1930s, just to kind of bring us from then forward to policies that happen. So a lot of the words that will occur in this book, one of them is de jure, which is practices that are legally recognized. So meaning that it wasn't exactly a law, but it was just kind of a thing that people did where they felt it was right to do. And this has been something that Black people have been victim of since getting in this country. So many times, something may not be a law, but because so many do it and they're the majority,
Right.
then what happens is people just go along and they do it because even people who may have felt that, well, that's not really right, they go along because all their neighbors are doing it. So this book really had me from the very first chapter or the preface, which, as I started reading it, I came to find out one of the magazines that I, as a Black woman in my home, which I finally was able to afford and move into a home with my husband here after we worked really hard. One of the things that most women like to look in as far as magazines is Better Homes and Gardens, and I came to find out that that magazine encouraged segregation and racist policies.
Really?
Yep.
I've never heard that before because that
Yep.
used to be around the house all the time. Better homes and gardens. You go to the hospital. You go to the doctor's office, the dentist, whatever, and they always have better homes and gardens.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
didn't know that.
Mm-hmm. Fun fact. So let's jump into it. All right. Um, I start off by talking about some of the points. The author seems to think that Black people at some point in history had been raised from their lower status, stemming coming from slavery, and then they were free, and then they went through this Jim Crow era. So he sometimes kind of felt like Black people, they weren't as bad off as they were. They were raised out of their lower status. Um, but I have to point out that this is kind of the author's interpretation, and the author is white, but even he, as a white man, can see that Black people being raised from their lower status, they're still doing without. They're still grossly doing without. And this caste that Black people were placed in has never really been lifted.
Mm-mm.
This place that we were, in, we came here really as victims. So I think it's time that history kind of says it, just like they say it about people in the Holocaust. They need to say that about Black people here in America. So he's talking about, how Reconstruction came, and really Black people just never really recovered from slavery, because after that Reconstruction, um the Jim Crow era started, and Black people, began to move, and we were not welcomed in many places. So we start to begin with the racial zoning. The Center for Public Integrity article published in August of 2015 that environmental racism persists, and the EPA is one reason why. So when we think about things like this, we don't really think about it as affecting us. We think about EPA as maybe like dirty water, or let's go out and save the ocean, let's clean up a beach. But really, the EPA is supposed to protect people that live in neighborhoods,
Mhm.
their homes and stuff. And so from the very beginning, Black people were always given the lesser. And so the article states that racism played a part in many Black Americans getting no help when it came to environmental dangers for over 22 years,
Wow.
in which the office never once made a formal finding of a Title Six violation, a civil rights under the Civil Rights Division. So there were 162 complaints, which were rejected. 38 complaints were not reviewed, and 64 were accepted. The EPA, in fact, doesn't deny the dispute. They claim to be moving forward to be fair to all. So I looked at this because there's actually a neighborhood that's in Chapel Hill that basically contacted the EPA years ago.
Mhm.
Um, so they haven't actually done anything concrete to stop the pattern of residential racism when it comes to building factories, waste disposal, and chemical plants in Black neighborhoods. So Velveeta Golightly Howell declined to discuss prior cases to her tenure, which began in 2014.
And
She
that's the
stressed that.
Environmental Protection Agency.
Mhm.
Okay.
She stressed that they're committed to making a visible difference in communities. However, she also stated, we cannot focus on the past. So basically, what they're saying is neighborhoods that Black people were put in that caused them harm, even death, it's just never going to be rectified, but they're just going to move forward, which is code for no reparations for past and acknowledge deliberate wrongdoing. In this way, the EPA failed to protect Black citizens' environmental rights, causing many to develop health problems, their neighborhoods to become undesirable slums, and loss of um, home ownership equaling generational wealth. So many of these neighborhoods, like there's a case here in 1991, a case arose in Warren County, North Carolina,
Mm.
whose overall population was about half white and half African American. The county had 3 existing landfills,
Mm-hmm.
all in African American areas. When a new landfill was proposed for white area, residents protested, and county officials did not issue a permit. But when another was proposed, this time in an African American area, county officials ignored residents' protests and approved the landfill. A federal judge upheld the county's decision, finding that there was discriminatory impact, but no explicit racial intent.
Mm.
So
And that's Warren County, which is
that's
about
Warren
15
County.
minutes away from what was Soul City.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So that's one of the ways that racism was kind of done towards Black people. We were put in these undesirable areas, as it being the only place that we could buy a home.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it gets deeper and darker than that. So we have to ask about, these neighborhoods that Black people eventually were able to move in. Who was responsible for the destabilization of these neighborhoods?
Mm.
Well, for starters, the FHA kind of blackballed Black people, and the FHA is supposed to be kind of fair for all. But
Supposed
what
to
a
be.
don't know is that they were not really fair to Black people. They kind of allowed you to participate, meaning you could sign up for it. That didn't mean you were going to get anything. Um, so the underwriting manuals in the 1940s specified lower valuation using terms like compatibility among neighborhood occupants, lacking to use as a tool to keep Blacks out of home ownership. The FHA would not approve, so banks would not issue mortgages. Also, no loans were given to colored developments per the FHA. Whites who owned homes and rented or sold to Blacks were blacklisted by the FHA. So
And what year are we talking?
we are talking 1958.
Mm.
So this was regardless of their credit worthiness. So in 1958, a white San Francisco school teacher, Gerald Kahn, purchased a house with an FHA guaranteed mortgage in the Elmwood district of Berkeley. By the closing date, Mr. Kahn wasn't ready to move in, and while keeping up his mortgage payments, rented the house to a fellow teacher, Alfred Simmons, an African American. The Berkeley chief of police asked the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. Like, so he really doesn't want this guy here.
Right.
To inquire as to how this Black guy, managed to get into an all white community. Now remember, the FHA is here and they're not supposed to discriminate against people. Let's remember. The Bureau questioned Gerald Kahn's neighbors in San Francisco, but failed to find evidence that he had obtained his mortgage under false pretenses. In other words, that he had never intended to occupy his Berkeley home, but had always planned to rent to an African American. The FBI referred the case to the U.S. attorneys, who refused to prosecute because no law had been broken. No law, but what was the word we learned earlier? Remember that word? De jure. De jure. So basically, white people felt like, dude, you're breaking the law. You're not supposed to be here. But no real law had been broken. Okay, so the U.S. attorney who refused to prosecute because the law had not been broken. The FHA, however, then blacklisted Mr. Cowan, advising him that he would be denied the benefits of participation in the FHA insurance program and never again be able to obtain a government-backed mortgage. The director of the San Francisco FHA wrote him, and this is what he wrote. This is to advise you that any application for mortgage insurance under the program for this administration submitted by you or any firm in which you have 10% interest will be rejected on the basis of an unsatisfactory risk determination made by this office on April 30th, 1959.
Mm.
So, in thousands of communities, the FHA policy was the same, with very few exceptions. No guarantees for mortgages to African Americans or to whites who might lease to an African American, regardless of the applicant's credit worthiness. So, even if a Black person, had great credit, always paid their bills on time, they didn't want them in that neighborhood.
Mm.
Let's go further down the rabbit hole. By the time we reach here in the book, I'm on page 74 now. By the time we reach here in the book, we see a pattern emerging of discriminatory housing practices backed by and enforced and even encouraged and rewarded by the FHA. So, it's just really sad. I started really looking. Hang on a second. Let me find my page. During the 1930s, the Roosevelt administration created maps for every metropolitan area,
Mm-hmm.
divided them into zones based on foreclosure risk, based in part on race. So, really, that risk went up if they felt that it was too close to a Black neighborhood.
Wow.
Even though there was no real proof that having Blacks in these neighborhoods resulted in the value going down.
But we see, and not to interrupt, but I just want to interject. We see the same thing going on today. But continue.
So the same thing has been going on. So the FHA, rejected proposals for projects like deporters that might house African Americans or otherwise threaten future integration. So really what they didn't want to happen was they didn't want Blacks and white living close enough where they might mix and actually get along and have a productive society.
For more information about that, everybody read J.A. Rogers' work. But continue.
Mm-hmm. Um, the FHA was unable to show any proof that African Americans moving into neighborhoods decreased value. Statistical evidence contradicted it, in fact, in 1942. Often racial integration caused property values to increase. These are all just myths. But in short, the FHA policy denying African Americans access to most neighborhoods created conditions that prevented property values from falling when they did appear. So it's kind of like they would charge Black people more.
Mm-hmm.
But really, the value would go up because by the time they've finished, charging them more, let's say a house was 40,000. Well, they might charge the Black family, well, if you really want to live here, you got to pay 60.
Mm.
And they would pay it. So Blacks were willing to pay more raised value. They would charge higher prices for the same home. The FHA still continued. In one respect, however, and I'm on the second chapter called White Flight.
Mm-hmm.
The second paragraph. In one respect, however, the FHA's theories about property values would become self-fulfilling. So just like in the Frances Cress Welsing and also in the Black on Black violence, another kind of self-fulfilling prophecy,
Mm-hmm.
that
They
kind of
create the conditions.
create the conditions. An African American influx could reduce a neighborhood's home prices as a direct result of the FHA policy, not because the Black people were bad tenants. The inability of African American families to obtain mortgages for suburban dwelling created opportunities for speculators and real estate agents to collude in blockbusting. So blockbusting is a scheme in which the spectators they bought the properties on these borderline Black-white areas and rented and sold them to African Americans at above market price. And then they persuaded white families residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into these slums. So sometimes they would have these tactics where they might get a black woman to walk through their neighborhood with a stroller, or two black guys to drive around in a car blasting music, looking suspicious, and they pay them for this
And the purpose of that was
to frighten white people that live there, because they'd look out and be like, "Oh my God, there goes the neighborhood."
Mhm.
They move out, and when they did
Mm.
that, they would sell their houses.
And that's why they call
Sometimes,
it blockbuster.
there you
Gotcha.
go.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm. And so, which is illegal. So they would do this, and then they would, become predatory lenders. So
Is
once
that
they,
is that where the term "there goes the neighborhood" comes from?
I think so.
Yeah.
So real estate firms then sold their newly acquired properties at inflated prices to African Americans, expanding their residential boundaries. Because most Black families could not qualify for mortgages under FHA and bank policies, agents often sold these homes on installment plans, similar to the ones Mr. Charles Vanderdot developed in DePores. So, which no equity was accumulated. So they were buying these homes, they were making the payments on time as best they could, but they would never obtain generational wealth. So if one payment was missed, they could come and take the house. So these were known as contract sales. So these agreements usually provided that ownership would transfer to purchasers after 15 or 20 years. But if a single monthly payment was late, the speculator could evict the would-be owner who had accumulated no equity. The inflated sale prices made it all the more likely that payments would not be on time. Owners, speculators would then resell these homes to new contract buyers. So the cycle went on like this. Um, you know, and then the falling sale prices in neighborhoods where blockbusters created white panic was deemed as proof by the FHA that property values would decline if African Americans moved in. So really what they did was they didn't protect African American home buyers the way they protected white people. They didn't give them insurance, so then they wouldn't give them money for a down payment. Returning troops were not given VA loans. So playing cards without a fixed desk. I'm looking at Dale's comment. Yeah, Dale. So, basically they kind of boxed them in. So, and then said, well, see, I told you. But they set the bar so high. It was like they were playing limbo, and they said, well, they're never going to be able to go into that. And then they lit the stick on fire. Well, of course they're not. You're setting it up so that they deliberately fail.
Mm-hmm. Dale
So,
said predatory lending.
hmm and then this is something that, people often ask, well, Black people just live in the ghetto, but who made the ghetto? So,
Right.
here it says because Black contract buyers knew how easily they could lose their homes, they struggled to make their inflated monthly payments. Husbands and wives both worked double shifts. They neglected basic maintenance because they couldn't afford it. They subdivided their apartments, crammed in with extra tenants, and when possible, charged their tenants hefty rents. White people observed that their new Black neighbors overcrowded and neglected their properties. Overcrowded neighborhoods meant overcrowded schools. In Chicago, officials responded by double shifting the students, half attending in the morning, half in the afternoon. So children were deprived of a full day of schooling and left to fend for themselves in the after school hours. Conditions helped fuel the rise of gangs, which in turn terrorized shop owners and residents alike. In the end, whites fled these neighborhoods not only because of the influx of Black families, but also because they were upset about overcrowding, decaying schools, and crime. But Black contract buyers did not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date. Whites could leave, Blacks had to stay.
Mm.
So, you know, the white people are not really looking at their part in it, meaning you don't want these Black people to move in. You're arguing every time they get a chance to move in and pay the same fee by making, things harder for them. And then when they move in, because they've moved in and done so much just to get there, then they have to kind of struggle to keep their head above water.
Mhm.
So, they're going to fail. It's just a matter of when.
Which isn't much different from what I gathered so far from the whole sharecropping thing. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't slavery, but
Right.
it became sharecropping. You really
Mm-hmm.
didn't have any control
You
by
didn't.
by any other word. It was still slavery. They just called it sharecropping. But continue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, the FHA again still found racist ways to avoid blacks, having any part in the FHA loans. And then even the tax man had a hand in the corruption. So, um, the IRS supported compliant regulators. So basically, the IRS, would give some people or certain people tax breaks.
Mm.
Churches, schools, and many of these places were segregated, and they would even give them incentives if they kept the area segregated.
Well, so that was really the birth of gentrification, huh?
Um,
Kind of,
Not
because when
quite
they
just
give white
yet, because
business kind of when they give white business incentives to come, develop in the area.
well, this wasn't even the businesses. This was
It's home. Okay.
this was like homeowners. So the
Mm.
federal public housing packed African Americans into urban projects, and federal loan insurance subsidized white families dispersed into single family suburban homes.
Mm.
Um, Local governments also contributed to and reinforced the segregation of metropolitan areas. One was the willingness of the Internal Revenue Services to grant tax exempt status to churches, hospitals, universities, neighborhood associations, and other groups that promoted residential segregation. So it's not really, this is like everyone.
Mm. Okay.
Everyone. But I would like to add, Black people were still paying their taxes. So even though they were paying their taxes, they were not allowed to enjoy the benefits of their fellow citizens who were white, you know, which is crazy. The IRS has always had an obligation to withhold tax favoritism from discriminatory organization, but it almost never acted to do so. So, you know, it's crazy. I don't think they did that until the 1970s,
Mm.
16 years after Brown versus Board education. The IRS granted tax exemptions to private whites only academies that had been established throughout the South to evade the ruling. It rejected the exemptions only in response to a court injunction won by civil rights groups. So, you had these clubs and things that would just be like, yeah, no blacks allowed, but
Right.
they were still getting tax exemptions. And finally, after someone really pushed and objected, then they said, well, we can't keep giving you this. But they were never going to say anything. If no one said anything, they weren't going to say anything.
Mm.
Yet they continue to collect black tax money. Um, so I'll go into another one.
For those just tuning in, we're discussing the book "The Color of Law," or I like to call it "How the Hood Became the Hood." But continue.
Mm-hmm. So, you still have and then, even the banks were in on it. So racially discriminatory government activities did not end 50 years ago. On the contrary, some have continued into the 21st century. One of the most troubling has been the regulatory tolerance of banks reverse redlining. Now, this I think is really sometimes what I think is going on in Durham. Um, Excessive marketing of exploitative loans in African American communities. This was an important cause of the 2008 financial collapse because these loans, called subprime mortgages, were bound to go into default. When they did, lower middle class African American neighborhoods were devastated, and their residents with their homes foreclosed were forced back into lower income areas. In the early 2000s, reverse redlining was tolerated, sometimes winked at by bank regulators. So banks, institutions, and mortgage companies designed subprime loans for borrowers who had a higher risk of default, and they charged a higher interest rate. So, in itself, this was a legitimate practice, but federally regulated banks and other lenders created many subprime loans um, with conditions that were designed to make repayment difficult. These mortgages had high closing costs and prepayment penalties and low initial teaser interest rates that skyrocketed after borrowers were locked in. So, you know, this was kind of predatory and it happened a lot. So sometimes when you look around, at homes that were built, in the 2000s, and then you see that people suddenly can't pay, and then you see all these people moving in and gentrification occurring. This is what's going on. These are the people that were probably getting ready to close to retiring, or maybe in their 40s. They finally saved up enough money, got a home, and the rates skyrocketed and they lost their homes. And then someone, we won't say who, was able to say, hey, this house, I can afford this dirt cheap. The taxes haven't been paid. I can just swoop in.
Mm-hmm.
And where did those people that lost their homes go?
Right.
No one ever really asks that question. No one who, doesn't care is going to
Right.
ask the question. They don't care. We ask how the hood became the hood. Once African Americans had been pushed into certain neighborhoods, municipal services in the neighborhood declined. Streets, for example, were more likely to be unpaved. Let's just talk about Roxborough Road. How many people have driven and felt like they were on the video game Frogger,
Mm-hmm.
down potholes and stuff?
Right.
You are not going to find that on Six Forks Road. That will never happen. Um, Streets were more likely to be unpaved than in other parts of the city. Sewers were poorly maintained and often clogged, and bus routes that served were suspended during the summer. Sometimes, now this is a neighborhood they're talking about because the same route served the University of Texas. But this is stuff that's still happening now.
Mm-hmm.
This is still happening now. And here's one that would be interesting for us. In the case of Raleigh and surrounding Wake County, North Carolina, is particularly noteworthy because in recent years, advocates of school integration have praised the country for its program of busing children to make its schools more diverse. Barred by the Supreme Court from explicitly integrating schools by race, the district, which includes the city of Raleigh and its suburbs, has bused low-income children from the south and east sides to the country to middle class neighborhoods in the north and west. As it happens, children in the southeast are mostly black, while those in the northwest are mostly white. The segregated design that the busing was designed to overcome was no accident. It was created in part by racially motivated school siting decisions in the early 20th century. So this is not a mistake. You can still, go down there. I think I was asking Sharon about Idlewild and College Park. How these middle class neighborhoods, they used to be nice.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go down there now, it's, not so nice, you know. So, they're just talking about the board provided Idlewild and College Park's middle class residents with a new school. It put the campus next to the city dump and a rock quarry filled with stagnant water. Like, why would you do that? So these are the conditions that that they feel are acceptable for Black people. There was nothing hidden about the racial context of these school site decisions, and they generated considerable debate and editorial in the Moderate Raleigh Times said. So this is actually in a magazine, and I think I'll read what it said in the magazine. It said the Negroes making protests are of the best element of the race in Raleigh. So these were middle class people. Many of them live in the northeastern section, already occupied by a numerous growing population of Negro citizens, the majority of whom are owners of their own homes. They have built up with who knows what sacrifice a self respecting and steadily improving community. It is a fact well known that the northeastern Negro section was due largely to the desire of better class Negroes to escape the very rock quarry locality in which it is suggested the new school will take place. So, they basically took more black people and put them there. So these people that worked so that their kids would, be in a school where there was an adequate amount of teacher to student ratio. Now it's just overcrowded, you know. And if white people had protested that, they would be like, well, we'll put them somewhere else.
Right.
Schools were built per race to encourage races to move their families where children couldn't integrate. So they basically built schools segregated. They would build these schools, and then if white people and black people were living too close together, they'd say, hey, why don't you move to this area? Your child won't have to go to school with a black child. And the white family would move because most of them had built up so much fear about integration that it didn't take much convincing. So the thing about it is, you know, they say that critical race theory doesn't belong in schools, but I think it should be in schools because this is the very reason that, you have schools like Northern where I refuse to let my son go. It was just run down, and it was built specifically for black kids. But now with integration, when I went there, you had white kids, you had Hispanic, but the majority was black. It was just it was just worse than a prison that I've seen. I've seen cleaner prisons.
Wow.
Northern High School
They're making it
was
now.
really built for white kids. That northern section was white, and the only reason it's gone down is because black kids have integrated it. Because it used to be where blacks didn't go to Northern.
Now, when did they integrate?
1992.
Are you serious?
But that's when Sharon, you can speak on this, but really around 1992 when it used to just be one school system. I mean, it used to be two school systems, the county and the
Right.
city. And I think around 92, they combined it to one school system. But Sharon knows more about that.
Northern High School and Southern High Schools were the white schools.
Mm-hmm.
And black kids did not go to either one of them until, like Minister Paul just said. And so now that black kids are going to these predominantly what used to be white schools, they don't care about them. Because now you got a fluctuation of a lot of black kids there. So really, because then what white people did, the ones that got money put their kids in private schools.
So it's self-fulfilling prophecy, basically saying, well, don't let your kids go to school with these black kids or they're not going to get a good education.
So you got schools like Durham Academy popped up. Durham Academy is
I saw Durham Academy.
Very, very white. You got some blacks go there because I had a niece graduate from there, but you better have some money. And then Duke also have their own academy. And so it's a cycle where white people find a way to still get away from us having to deal with us if they don't want to, because they know we don't have the dollars and cents that they have.
Right. And one of the things that I have noticed, and this was something that happened even back then in the 50s and 60s, was they would um they would find land in the poor areas. They would find land and build because the property tax was cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
They would bus kids from somewhere else. So like it makes me think about Voyager School, which is right up the street from me. Beautiful. But if you drive past that school, you're gonna see maybe 1 out of 10 kids are black.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe 1 out of 10, but none of them are from this area.
Right.
They are not. It's almost like they're afraid that their child is somehow going to have to realize that they're privileged in the midst of all this. Like they just want to bring them to school, drop them in carpool. They never want them to actually look at that route where they're coming to school. They probably come uh maybe Carver, but most of them bypass Carver. They never come up Danube. Never. They don't, it's like they don't want to see that route where they have to take and realize that, hey, I've never seen any of my classmates that live over in Oxford. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like in all the years that it's been there, that's gotta be that. I know it's a lottery, but what are the odds? What are the odds? So they don't want, yeah, Dale, you're right. They don't want black boys with their daughters. But the thing is, their daughters are creeping to the hood anyway. Their daughters
Exactly.
are women, and they pick who they think is a superior man anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Or they pick someone that they feel is a taboo for daddy. Whereas if kids are raised together, then they can learn about each other's cultures, and decide who they want to pick, not who their parents gear them to want to pick, because kids are going to do what they want to do anyway.
The thing that white fathers tried to keep away from their children the most was having relationships with opposite races.
Mm-hmm.
They did not want their white daughters with a black boy, or their black son, I mean their white boy with a black girl.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why they kept the schools so segregated, to make sure of that. And when they saw that they won't win in that fight, then
Mm-hmm.
they created all these private schools.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's where private became
Press.
so
Yeah.
popular.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. um so I'll move on to state sanctioned violence. Dale, you're right. Genetic annihilation. They are very afraid of that. So in 1952, this is a story that actually happened, and this is just one of many stories. In 1952, Wilbur Gary, a building contractor, was living with his family in one of Richmond, California's housing projects. He was an African American Navy war veteran, so this man served in the war.
Mm-hmm.
They needed to find a new residence. Their apartment was slated for demolition because the Federal Lanham Act had required government projects for war workers only to be temporary. A fellow Navy veteran was moving out of Rollingwood, the suburb just outside of Richmond, built during World War II, with an FHA requirement that the suburb be covered with restrictive covenants. And when I say restrictive, I mean a restrictive covenant is probably one that many people, if they look back in the deed of their home was built in 1920s, they'll find that there was a restrictive covenant. This barred Black people from living there, anyone from selling to them or even renting to them. 4 years earlier, though, the Supreme Court had ruled that covenants were not enforceable. So Hogan sold his property to Wilbur Gary and his wife. Now, I'll say it again, the Supreme Court ruled that these covenants were not enforceable. But what was the word? De jure. So even though it wasn't enforceable, people still felt that someone Black living in a white neighborhood was breaking the law. and they enforced it. Nonetheless, the Rolling Improvements Association, home ownership group, these are the people that lived in the neighborhood, insisted that its covenants gave it the right to evict African Americans. The NAACP came to the family's aid and dared the group to try and enforce it. The neighbors then attempted to buy back the Gary house for nearly 15% more than the Garys paid. They refused the offer. My question is, why did they refuse the offer? I sometimes think Black people, you know, we know we're entitled to something, but if I move into a neighborhood and I'm the only Black family and I start seeing 500 cars show up in my yard and they offering me 15% more, I'm gonna say, what about 25% more? And I'm gone. Mm-hmm. You don't want me there. You feel like you need to terrorize me. We good. So soon after the Garys arrived, a mob of about 300 whites gathered outside their home, shouting, hurling bricks. One crashed through the front window and burning across on the lawn for several days. Police and county sheriff deputies refused to step in. Now, these are taxpayers. The Black people are taxpayers too. So the NAACP found it necessary to organize its own guards. So again, it's up to us to protect our own. A Communist Party affiliated civil rights group also provided help. The journalist Jessica Milford, in her book A Fine Old Conflict, described her participation in the group's effort, which included escorting Miss Gary and the children to work and school and patrolling nearby streets to alert the Garys to mobs that might be gathering. Meanwhile, the NAACP pressed California Governor Earl Warren, Attorney General Brown, and the local district attorney to step in. They eventually did so, ordering the city police and county sheriff to provide the family with protection. Still, the protests and harassments continued for another month, with continued pleas from the family and civil rights groups for the police to intervene. No arrests, however, were made. The sheriff claimed that he did not have enough manpower to prevent the violence. Yet a single arrest is probably all that it would have been taken to make the mob withdraw. And historically, the law has not protected Blacks and their property from white violence. This is historical. This is not something that is isolated to one incident. Historically, when Black people purchase something, if white people want it, or if they feel like some wrong occurred to them on Black property, Black cities, Black towns, Black churches, a school, a house, a business, they're going to burn it down. Whereas Black people don't have that same courtesy for violence given to them by the cops. They're not going to look the other way. So when people get all up in arms and riled up about riots that they see Blacks committing when someone in their neighborhood gets killed and a cop goes free, they wonder why Black people burn down their own neighborhoods. It's because those businesses aren't theirs. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dale. Yep. Rosewood, Florida. Yep. Mm-hmm. So,
that's what sparked the Great Migration.
Yeah. And historically, whites were the ones exhibiting violence and destruction of property via mobs of Blacks, yet claim Blacks drive down property values because they're violent. What the Gary and what the family's experience was not an aberration. During much of the 20th century, police tolerance and promotion of cross burnings, vandalism, arson, and other violent acts to maintain residential segregation was systematic and nationwide. So it wasn't isolated. These are not isolated incidents. And Paul, I think I gave you, are you able to pull up those photographs?
Let me see. Yeah, continue and I'll
Okay.
Yeah.
So American so then you had I'm looking at a specific one. Mm-hmm. So this is just one family who moved into a home where they basically, the neighborhood basically did not want them there. Um, and they continued the harassment and eventually um, burned part of their house. Let me hold this one. Thank you. Good. Well, let's see. I think I should have the illustration in here. From what page that is on? Da, 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 da. Here it is. Yeah, I have it. So yeah, that picture you showed, that was taken in 1954. Andrew Wade, an African American electrical contractor and Korean War Navy veteran, wanted to purchase a house in a middle class African American neighborhood. But he couldn't find anything suitable. And a friend with a prominent job suggested he looked at a white middle class community instead. So Braden and his wife then agreed to buy a house for Andrew Wade and his wife. The Wades found a property in Chivoli, an all white suburb, which the Bradens bought, signing over the deed. When the Wades and their child were moving in, a crowd gathered in front, and a cross was burned on an empty lot next door. On the first evening that they spent at the home, a rock was crashed in the front window with a message to it, "Nigger, get out." And later that night, 10 rifle shots were fired through the glass of its kitchen door. Under the watch of a police guard, demonstrations continued for a month until the house was dynamited. I'll say that again, under the watch. So how many of us feel like, we basically have violence that is occurring in our neighborhoods under the watch of many police officers? The police guard said that he saw nothing. There was one arrest following the Wades moving in of Andrew Wade and a friend for breach of the peace because Mr. Wade had failed to notify the police that the friend would be visiting. The police chief was familiar enough with the bombers to warn Carl Braden that the people responsible for blowing up the Wade property were targeting the Braden home next. So the police are kind of complicit in the violence. And this is nothing new for Black people. These incidents happened less than 100 years ago. State-sponsored violence was a means, along with many others, by which all levels of government maintained segregation in Louisville and elsewhere. The Wades and the Marshalls were only two middle-class families confronted with hostile state power when they tried to cross that residential color line. How many other middle-class African Americans were intimidated from attempting to live in neighborhoods of their own choosing after hearing the Wade and Marshall experiences? Did the next generation have fear of integration from their parents? And how long do the memories of such events last? How long do they continue to intimidate? So for me, I just feel like, these incidents happened less than 100 years ago. The stains of these terrorizing behavior tactics are lingering. So people, don't really think about this as an act of terrorism, but these are terroristic acts. Many Black people still have this lingering in their mind, yet our government must conduct studies before deciding on whether reparations for Black Americans, can be given, and if policing was done that way, how much more possible is it that, police look the other way when violence escalates in the hood now? How much more possible is it that that's something that's occurring? No whites are victims. No whites are ever hit by stray bullets. But even in this period of gentrification, where the color lines in the hood have become kind of blurred, white women jog, before the sun goes up or down, whether it's dark, and a black woman is in a hurry when that sun is going down. So this is deliberate, this allowing of death and terrorizing and destruction of black bodies and property from stores to cars. This system of white ignorance and innocence has kind of paved the way. The same ancestors who chased a black boy and drowned him for being on the wrong side of the lake by throwing a stone at him is responsible. So white silence to black neighborhood destruction, it's downright criminal. It's benign consent. I didn't rape her, but I saw what happened. So at some point, they're going to have to take responsibility if they want these ghettos to stop popping up, unless they feel like they benefit from it.
And we're almost at the hour mark, but I definitely want to hit on one aspect of the book. I definitely want you to hit on the urban renewal part, the building of the highways.
Let's see. Let me get to that. Well, these were kind of the urban renewal part was really a policy thing, because in a lot of, and I'm trying to find.
Yeah, while you're looking for it, I'll just give a brief comment. Yeah, in the book, it talks about how highways were constructed through black neighborhoods. And initially, the thought was it would promote integration. But it actually resulted in people losing their houses, like what happened in Haiti and Durham. This wasn't just local. We're talking about a federal program stretching back to, they started talking about, I think in the 1930s, it began to come into fruition the 50s, late 50s and early 60s in Durham. But yeah, that's how urban renewal began to destroy Haiti and other areas of Durham.
Here's one that I did see. These transportation policies. So a lot of the transportation policies were rooted in racism. They affected the African American population, such as Baltimore. It illustrates how these followed throughout decades. So over 4 decades, successful proposals for rail lines or even a highway to connect African American neighborhoods to better opportunities have been scuttled because finances were short, and building expressways to serve suburbanites was a higher priority. And this isolated African Americans. It was so in 1975, this is in Maryland. Maryland proposed a rail line to connect suburban Anne Arundel County and downtown Baltimore to white suburbanites. Pressed their political leaders to oppose the plan, which they did. So white people didn't want these railways and trains or even buses to come through where they live. But at the same time, these highways, which people from the suburbs could use to get in and out of the city without having to deal with, black faces, they went straight on through them. So, this same thing that happened, a review by Johns Hopkins University's researchers concluded that the residents believed that the rail line, this is white people, would enable poor inner city blacks to travel to the suburbs and steal the residents' TVs and then return to their ghettos. Maryland State Transportation Secretary stated that his office would not force a transit line on an area that clearly does not want it, failing to explain how he balanced the desire of a white suburban area that clearly does not want it with the desires of urban African Americans. So, and this is one of those cases where the majority, even though it wasn't morally right, was allowed to decide what was done. And so this is pretty much what has happened in Durham and in other communities where they just decided, hey, I feel like a highway would be great for this area. Let's just go straight through it. Even though this is a thriving community, I feel like there's more of us than there are of them. So let's just go on and do it. So 40 years later, in this incident, little had changed. In 2015, Maryland's governor canceled a proposal rail link to Baltimore's West Side Black neighborhood, saying the funds were needed for highway improvement. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund then filed a complaint with the U.S. Department of Transportation, claiming that Maryland's priority for highways over mass transit had a disparate impact on African Americans. The case was still pending when the Obama administration left office. You know, every brother ain't a brother.
Right. Especially in Durham, because it was the government gave out money, incentives, so to speak,
right,
for urban renewal in Durham. So that's why we have the shootings and things right now, because even 50, 60 years ago, they predicted the creation of super ghettos because they were taking people's houses and pushing them, into public housing. And like you said, when they did that, they didn't upkeep those areas. But continue.
And another thing that they allowed to happen, after things like that happened, they had these tax credit properties. And that's something that is kind of big. That makes me think about these fires. So tax credit property owners could build where land was cheap or purchase a cheap building, apartment complex, or housing project owned, and it was owned by a landlord who participated in the low income housing tax credit. It was designed to encourage investors to build housing for low income populations, equals Black people. And often they were already built in a segregated, area where crime was high and it was poor. So they would build these, these projects or just lower income apartments. But they would almost always put them where it was already overpopulated. And then they would move Black people who were kind of somewhat in an integrated area, but just, making it where the rent went up, they would just move them out.
Right.
You ask where the Black people go, that's where they go. And these people that do this are getting rich off of poverty. So they're getting a tax incentive to do this. So it's just, I guess I'll close, for me, this is really it really is, again, it comes back around to why I feel like, critical race theory does need to be taught in school. You have white and Black students study history, whether it's rich or poor schools, segregated or integrated. They have books that still, teach that, white and Black people were both given the same opportunities in these times. They both got, they got an FHA loan, so while the white student is sitting there feeling a sense of achievement, and pride over how his parents came to be in this country and how they made themselves rich over 3 generations, the Black student has a sense of failure. All children that are allowed to continue believing this lie they're in danger, because it's putting up a false sense of what's happening. This pull yourself up by the bootstrap mentality, thinking that many middle and upper class whites have, done better. But, when they're confronted by history, they get angry, but their forefathers, their great-grandfathers, their grandfathers, their daddies, they all played major roles in, unleveling that playing field to gain, keep gaining an unfair advantage, knowing full well the cost effect on Black people. So, this book just really shows how they used any means necessary to keep Black people. And I say Black people because it's specifically Black people that this was done to. It wasn't really done to, Hispanic people, because they weren't here yet in that capacity. They weren't even really allowed to come here. You did have some Japanese people, but again, most of them, when they got here, they specifically went to areas where they were already at, so that they could have all the comforts that they needed. But Black people were deliberately, by law and sanctions and violence, kept from doing better. Even when the Constitution said, hey, it's okay, let them join in, white people still decided, no, we're not following the law. So the author, is calling, one of the things that, people say, well, what do we do now? He had some final thoughts, where he's basically calling for policymakers and white Americans who participate, whether past or present, they benefit from it. In the continued racist behavior, white America needs to swallow the pill. The same pill Neo swallowed, they need to swallow that pill and wake up. They need to unplug from the matrix of racism and stop pretending that they don't see it. They need to see it, because, until they really see it, I think they see it. They just don't really look. They don't want to see it. They see it in their car. They see it on the news when they, scroll and see someone Black committing a crime or someone getting murdered, but they don't see their part in it. They don't want to see that. And so anytime that it comes up in school where they have to be confronted with it, they don't want to see it. They don't want to know. It's like a horror movie where they know something's going to happen and they cover their eyes. They don't want to see it. But in the horror movies, whether you cover your eyes or not, somebody always gets slashed. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Right.
So the author does have some frequently asked questions, which I thought were not funny, but questions that I have heard before. One of them that was one of my favorite ones was, this question says, don't Black people have to take more responsibility for their own success? Crime rates in Black neighborhoods are high, and so whites will resist integration because they don't want African Americans bringing crime into white neighborhoods. Young men join gangs and will sell drugs even when jobs are available. Doesn't Black ghetto culture have to change before we can consider integration? And his answer was, certainly, everyone, Black, white, and others, should take greater responsibilities for their own success. African Americans are no exception, and neither are white Americans. Having agreed on that, let's review some facts. Most African American youths do take responsibility for their own success, and many work twice as hard to succeed. This responsibility and added effort frequently pay off, although the payoff is less than it is for whites. In 2014, of young ages 25 to 29, adult African Americans, 20% of men and 24% of women were college graduates. High school completion rates are over 90%. This suggests that a focus on the antisocial behavior of a minority of African Americans is too convenient an excuse for not taking steps to integrate the majority. The war on drugs, including the mass incarceration of young Black men and adolescent boys living in low-income African American neighborhoods, began in the 1970s. Current trends predict that as many as 1 in 3 African American men born today can expect to spend some time in prison during their lifetime. African American, considering this, it's surprising that African American college graduation rate is as high as it is. And I would like to state that, one of the things that was put in here, them asking that question, and that is a very real question. But having said that, when Black kids live in a poor neighborhood, they are kind of a victim to so many things. They're a victim of, maybe not having the lights on. They're a victim of, maybe not getting a ride to school, maybe their parent needed them to babysit, maybe, you know, they're sick because the environmental issues going on cause them to have asthma. They get to school, they can't focus, they've been up all night. But you know, poverty, you know, affects so many other things, and it's generational. So whites, blacks are 10 times more likely to live in a poor neighborhood. So 6% of whites and 66% of blacks. 7% of whites lived in a poor neighborhood for 2 generations or more, whereas 48% of black peoples lived in a poor neighborhood for 2 or more generations. So for whites, when they live in a poor neighborhood, maybe they just had a bad run that year. Maybe something happened and then they quickly bounce back. But for blacks, it's multi-generational. So if you're black and you lived in the projects, more than likely your child is going to live in the projects. And then their child might not live in the projects, but they're going to live in a poor neighborhood. So it's very hard to climb out of that deep hole and pass any sort of generational wealth on when you have someone giving you a high interest rate just to buy a home in an area that's safe and then robbing you when things don't go right. You know, so all of those things, you know, affect the outcome. So when white people say, well, why can't you just do like, you know, I mean, you guys have rights now, but all those things are kind of tainted because they were all rooted in racism, from the taxes to the home loans to ownership of property to, you know, they're all tainted. Most Americans, if they just simply, if they were really curious, could just go look at their deed. Just look at your deed.
And I think that is a good place to wrap up because it brought us full circle to what we're dealing with right now. And I think the bottom line is none of this is by accident. People play dumb, like, you know, we're natural born criminals, but excellent book review, Sister Minister information, Sister Spitfire, and we'll discuss later whether you want to do a part 2 of this or we're going to move on to another book. You are the Minister of Information. We'll do what you say. Sister Sharon, do you have any closing words before we break out for today?
Yes, I just have one thing I want to address. I think we need to address the term ghetto. That our people don't think that that term comes from us. That comes, it's a European term that was used for white people back when they didn't know anything about sanitation over in Europe, and they was dying from all kinds of diseases and things, and they were just very filthy. And so I don't think we should allow that term to describe us because we're not that like that. So I believe in calling our communities black neighborhoods
Yes.
instead of ghettos.
Yes, I agree. Because then really when you think about it, just like back then they didn't come through and do sanitation. It's just like, you know, if you go to any given project, I bet you after this snowstorm, I bet you after this will be a reason why trash won't get picked up for the next 2 weeks. But where do they think that trash is going to go? You know, are the residents supposed to take it to a private dump? Are they supposed to burn it? You know, so then it starts to spill out of the dump into the neighborhood. And then someone driving by will say, God, look at those people. They just throw trash anywhere.
Right.
Well, where do you want it to go? Another thing I've noticed is in black neighborhoods, they seldom have garbage cans on the corner. Now think about that. The next time that you're in a black neighborhood, think about how many garbage cans you see.
And that's because they use dumpsters. They don't, the city garbage collector put dumpsters over there. In poor neighborhoods. They don't come and pick up the trash from the curb like they do
Right.
in other neighborhoods.
Right, right. But my thing is like, if you take the bus and you get off of the bus and you've had a snack, well, you might not want to carry all of that onto your next bus if you've got to connect buses or walk home and it's raining, or and 9 times out of 10, someone may just drop it. They may just drop it.
And that's what they do. That's exactly what happens.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas even just as we were downtown Durham, you see they have a trash can on the corner. They have trash cans. Sometimes they even have recycling. They even have a place where you can give your dog water if you're outside buying ice cream, or getting your bike fixed, a place for your dog to drink water. So these are very well thought out things for the betterment of a community. And those are things that Black people should be entitled to as well. They shouldn't just have to wait for whites to start to move in and begin to gentrify, because there's this period where at first it'll seem like things are getting better because white people have moved in. But as soon as it becomes all white and the Black people get moved somewhere else, those services stop, and then they are just caught in that same vice-like cycle of just quote unquote ghetto living. This poor quality supermarkets. Even the supermarkets don't get restocked the same in Black neighborhoods. And white people that may feel like they don't want Black people in their neighborhood. Well, if we had things in our neighborhood that were equal, this was the main thing that the author was saying. Black people who want to be integrated should be able to do so without an issue. And most white people feel like they wouldn't mind living in an integrated neighborhood so long as they were the majority and Blacks were the minority. And Blacks felt the same. So long as the Black people were the majority, and whites were the minority, they didn't mind living integrated. So you're going to have some neighborhoods where maybe it's equal parts. You might have some Indian neighbors, you might have some Asian neighbors, some Hispanic ones. And so it's just, if that doesn't happen, then you're going to continue to have all Black neighborhoods where the quality is just poor. And that's deliberate, and that should not happen, because we're paying the same taxes. We're paying the same taxes.
A lot of times we're paying more taxes.
We are paying more. And the thing is, should we all just boycott paying our taxes? Like, well, shit, I'm paying for something. I'm paying for a service I'm not getting. So why should I continue to pay? Why should I continue to pay the police department when as soon as the sun goes down, they drive off? Do they not work at night? Do they not stop crime at night? Bullets don't stop at night.
They do not. And we have unpacked a lot of information in this short period of time. I urge everybody seeing this on replay on YouTube, Twitter, Color of Law, excellent book discussion, Sista Spitfire. I urge everybody to share this information, study this information, read the book, download this video, and use it for a reference. So anytime you see Black people being blamed for living in the quote unquote ghetto, you can pull up this video and you will have some background. Sisters, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I'm looking forward to our next book discussion. I think they're very powerful. So with that being said, I guess we can close out as always. And thank you, Spitfire. Thank you, Sister Sharon. Sister Sharon is our Chief of Staff. Sister Spitfire is our Minister of Information. And as always, we leave with the Black Messiah motto: stop waiting for a savior and be one. Shalom.
Shalom.
Have a good day, y'all.